Hey everybody, it's Refresh, and I'm here to take a look at the Allied Fires Challenger deck for Magic the Gathering. This is from the 2020 line of Challenger decks. According to the back, if you think the only thing cooler than a personal Planeswalker army is a personal Planeswalker army that can also turn into dragons, this deck is for you. It is pretty cool. Fires of Invention, I do believe, got banned in the end. Even though this deck wasn't the hottest deck at the time, I think, it turned out that some of the elements of this deck ended up being too good to be true. Contents include a battle-ready 60-card deck, a 15-card sideboard, 5 double-sided tokens, and a deck box. Let's go ahead and check those out. Here's our deck box. Inside is a spacer. There's nothing here. There used to be a spin-down life counter with these, but they stopped providing those. Instead, we have our sideboard, a small advertisement, a card divider, and our main deck. Let's take a look at the main deck. Now for the sideboard. Alright, so if you like playing Planeswalkers, this is a deck for you. There are a lot of Planeswalkers in here. I'll play this up against its rivals, and I'll be back to let you know what I think. Alright, so I've had a chance to play with this deck a bit, and I have some thoughts. The first thing to note is that this is kind of a control deck. It is a control deck that doesn't actually have any counter spells, and so what it's trying to do is it's trying to just play powerful things on your own turn and then eventually overtake your opponent through the value of either wiping out their boards with board wipes in the time wipes, the Deafening Clarions, or eventually getting a lot of value out of playing these Fires of Inventions and then doubling every turn your spells, and then being able to play, for example, 2 Planeswalkers and use a bunch of activated abilities as a result of the Fires of Invention. And this plan can work remarkably. When you get a Fires of Invention down, you can immediately play another 4-drop or less, which means that you can draw for Dreams to draw additional cards. You can play one of your 4 or 3 mana Planeswalkers. You can use Deafening Clarion to wipe out your opponent's smaller creatures. And when that happens, it's really awesome. And if you're able to put down a handful of Planeswalkers and then play Sarkhan the Masterless, then you can smash in with Planeswalkers as dragons, or you can use Sarkhan to create dragons. And so it's a combination of a Planeswalker theme along with the Fires of Invention idea, which was a deck in Standard at the time. And it's pretty cool in its conception, but its actual build has a lot of problems with it. And so one of the things that's an issue with the deck is that it is really slow. There are tap lands everywhere. As you can see, all of these lands here are tap lands. And because it's a 3-color deck, it really needs the multiple mana colors. And so having all these dual lands are important. And the Interplanetary Beacon is a little annoying, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But the problem with all these dual lands being tap lands, except for the one Steam Fence, which is a godsend, is that it makes the deck play a turn slower than you would think it should, based on the curve, right? Because there's so many tap lands, you're often playing things 1 or 2 turns behind. And so when your opponent has built a board by turn 3 and you need a Deafening Clarion, you're not going to often be able to play it until turn 4 or turn 5, which means that you're taking a huge pile of damage from creature decks before you can even do anything about them. And that is a problem with this deck. This deck really, really needs to have more shock lands instead of tap lands. And if you are interested in taking this deck and upgrading it, then the first thing I would do over anything else is to take out all of these Tranquil Coves, Swiftguard Cliffs, and Windscarred Crags and replace them with the respective shock land, so that you can play your land and then immediately play the thing that you need to play, instead of having to wait 1 or 2 additional turns to get your tap lands untapped. And so that's a major flaw with the deck, and one of the reasons why this deck will lose a lot, because it just can't play on curve most of the time. The Interplanar Beacon is there to help alleviate some of this tapped mana problem, because even though it is a colorless land, it does let you tap it to convert your mana into other colors to cast Planeswalker spells. And so it is a way to cast Planeswalker spells and fix for just Planeswalkers. But the problem is that sometimes you don't want to cast Planeswalkers, you need to deal with your opponent's threats. You need to cast a Time Wipe, or you need to cast a Deafening Clarion, or you need to cast a Banishing Light. These are your sort of control spells here. But because you have the Interplanar Beacon, you sometimes can't do that because you need the colors. And that's going to be a problem. As well as if you draw too many of these early, you can't even cast your Omens of the Seas or your Fae of Wishes. So the mana base makes this deck very challenging at times, and you're gonna be constantly frustrated by not drawing the colors that you need, or drawing tap lands when you need them to be untapped, or drawing an Interplanar Beacon when you need to cast a non-Planeswalker spell. That's a major flaw with the deck. There are some really clever things that this deck does, and I believe that this also fell in with the general Fires of Invention archetype, is that this deck, because it has Fires of Invention and you can't do things on your opponent's turn, and the Fires of Invention also makes it so that your spells don't cost mana anymore, it has a lot of activated abilities. Obviously the Planeswalkers are a strong fit for this kind of deck because these are all activated abilities. Once you play your Planeswalker, you can choose to use its abilities. And Narset will get you additional cards. The Saheeli is, I think, only there so that when you cast these other Planeswalkers or non-creature spells, you get the 1/1 servo. So this is kind of a roadblock for your opponent's creature decks, or ways to chump, I suppose. And that's what this is. And you can turn it into another creature you control using the Saheeli's -2 ability, but you're rarely going to end up doing that because this deck only has two kinds of creatures, your Fae of Wishes and your Kenrith the Return King. And this Kenrith, I don't think is normally in builds like this, but it's there as kind of a jack of all trades, because what you can do is you can pump all the mana that you're not using because of Fires of Invention into its abilities to do various things, like draw a card or gain 5 life, or put counters on it. Fae of Wishes is also a way for you to repeatedly get fixture cards from your sideboard to deal with whatever your opponent is doing. And so I think that that's an alright inclusion here as well, but it's not the best. Kasmina is here to help you go through your deck. Drawn from Dreams helps you go through your deck. Ugin the Ineffable gives you some amount of value because the spirits that it creates can block. You can chump them and get the cards that are under them, or you can trade even better. It is a little less in keeping with the general theme of the deck, especially because its color spells you cast cost 2 less to cast. Doesn't really matter for this entire deck, but it's an alright top end. I think that there could be better, and you might want to replace this with a different Planeswalker that has a little bit more punch. In terms of the sideboard, which is important because there's a Fae of Wishes here to get stuff from the sideboard, there is a small anti-control package, and this deck is going to struggle with control, because if it keeps getting its spells countered, or if you're unable to get your Fires of Invention down, this deck will really struggle to win because the Planeswalkers aren't going to do much by themselves, and you need that value to be able to get ahead of your opponent. And so there's only a small anti-control package in one Dovin's Veto, a Dovin Hand, the Dovin Planeswalker, and that's about it. Otherwise, you're kind of at the mercy of other control decks, especially decks with counterspells. And then there is a bit more cards in the package here to deal with, for example, big creatures with Fry, or pesky artifacts and enchantments with the Revoke Existence. But for the most part, I feel like the answers here are not that good, and part of that is the limitations of the Fires of Invention, because you can only play on your turn. You can't counter your opponent's counterspells. You can't pack a negate in this deck, because once you lay down that Fires of Invention on your turn, you're never going to be able to play that negate on your opponent's turn, and it will end up being your second spell, so it's not going to be that impactful. So I think that this deck has some issues, and it makes the playability of this deck a little uneven. I think that if you do like casting a lot of Planeswalkers, and you like big board wipes and stuff like that, then this deck is still an option for you. But I don't know that this particular build of this deck, but I don't know that this particular style of Fires of Invention deck was ever really a deck in Standard. And so it's curious that this made a Challenger deck. But that is my experience with this deck. This is okay out of the box for really casual play, but if you really want to take this deck and play competitively with it, or against other standard decks of the time, then you really want to upgrade this to some degree for it to be competitive. And that is my thoughts on Allied Fires. If you've had a chance to play with this deck, let me know what your thoughts are about it in the comments below. If you found this video helpful, hit the like button. If you'd like to see more of my videos, you can hit subscribe. This was Refresh. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.